I want to talk today about a tumultuous decade in American history, the 1960s. It is a time that Paul Johnson refers to as America's suicide attempt. It's something that had sweeping effects in all sorts of ways, though in part my thesis is that a lot of the changes that reached culmination during the 1960s actually begin earlier. They are the results in many ways of World War II. It was undoubtedly a time of tremendous social change, but in almost every respect, the changes began during and after World War II. And so it's in the late 40s and early 50s that you see the changes beginning. In fact, one time, actually in compiling a logic book and looking for good examples of jokes that were based on logic, I read, well, I didn't read everything, but I surveyed every Reader's Digest from the 1920s all the way up through the 1960s. And it's true that changes become much more obvious in the 1960s. It's a very staid publication in the 1920s and 1930s. But when is there dramatic change? When do topics about sexuality, for example, or social change or politics enter into the pages of Reader's Digest? It's after the Second World War. It's in the late 40s and 50s. Now, they're accompanied by color graphics in the 1960s, and it's much more overt. But the changes already are taking place during the late 40s and early 50s. And we're going to look at a variety of dimensions of changes where that's true. The first dimension I want to talk about is civil rights. Actually, the war changed the relations between the races dramatically. Why? In part because people were fighting together, and military commanders realized it was ridiculous to try to segregate army units. Now, one of the first ways in which this really got manifested in life in America was through baseball. Branch Rickey had been the general manager of the Cardinals throughout the 1940s. He then moved to the Brooklyn Dodgers. And the first thing he did, really, was sign Jackie Robinson to be the first black player in the major leagues. Here you see them actually reaching the agreement. Now that basically put an end to the Negro Leagues that had existed in addition to the American League and the National League and various minor leagues. Here you see perhaps the greatest player in the Negro Leagues, Josh Gibson, batting for the Homestead Grays. I grew up near Homestead, so I have strong affection for that team. But in any case, many of the players in the Negro Leagues ended up going into Major League Baseball. The first was Jackie Robinson, who really changed not just baseball, but American history in a way by being the person who integrated the first really major national institution. A lot of institutions, by the way, had been integrated after the Civil War. They were resegregated in part through the Civil Rights Acts of the 1870s, in part through Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1896 case that upheld the separate but equal doctrine, and in part by the Wilson administration, which segregated the federal government and so on. Jackie Robinson began to break that down. If you compare the stars of the 1940s in baseball and early 50s, Joe DiMaggio, Johnny Mize, Ted Williams, Ralph Kiner. These are the big home run hitters of the late 40s and early 50s. But then, by the time you get to the 50s and 60s, who are they? Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Roberto Clemente, Willie Stargell. You notice a certain pirate bias here. Bob Gibson. Now, interestingly, everybody I showed you there was in the National League. The National League integrated much more quickly than the American League, which is part of the reason the National League won almost every All-Star game for more than a decade. But in any case, it changed the face of baseball dramatically. And it was really the first step in what would become a series of steps affecting every major national institution. Now, the civil rights movement is something we tend to associate with the 1960s, but actually it got its start much earlier. Jackie Robinson joined the Dodgers in 1947. There were a lot of crucial steps taken during the 1950s under the Eisenhower administration. Brown versus Board of Education is the most famous. That was the ruling that declared segregation unconstitutional. But what was really dramatic throughout the 1950s is not just that ruling, but the fact that Eisenhower enforced that very aggressively. That required sending federal troops into the South in a number of places, most famously to integrate the schools in Little Rock in 1957. As I mentioned earlier, Plessy versus Ferguson had upheld this separate but equal doctrine. Brown said separate is inherently unequal. Now, the doctrine as developed in Brown actually reads very strangely. If you go back and read the Brown versus Board of Education decision, it's an odd decision. It rests on a lot of social science research. It seems to misinterpret the research. The research is not now viewed as in very favorable lights anyway. It's weird for the following reason. It would seem as if this is a result you can attain very easily without investigating social science and people's reaction to black or white dolls and so on. It's sort of like, wait, you're saying this person has a right to attend that school and this person doesn't, purely by virtue of the color of their skin. Obviously, that is not the equal protection of the laws. Who cares how people feel about it? So in a certain sense, I think a lot of the argument that the justices engage in Brown is just unnecessary to get the result they want. But in any event, the result was to say separate is not equal and schools have to be integrated. Well, schools weren't the only thing on the list. Rosa Parks famously refused to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama to a white passenger in 1955. And what resulted from that was the Montgomery bus boycott, which was led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Here is a scene from Little Rock in 1957. It helps to, I think, imagine the courage that it took to be among the first black students at a Little Rock school, just as it took great courage for Jackie Robinson to be the first black player in the major leagues. In 1957, the first of a series of civil rights acts was passed. Here you see a photograph of President Eisenhower at a signing ceremony. It created the Civil Rights Commission, and the main purpose of the commission was not just to investigate discrimination, but specifically to defend voting rights. In a lot of places, especially in the South, there were rules set up that disadvantaged blacks in voting and made it difficult for blacks to vote. So the Civil Rights Commission was a way of having the federal government intervene and try to defend black voting rights. There was a follow-up to that, the Civil Rights Act of 1960, again signed by Eisenhower, which expanded the authority of federal judges to protect voting rights even in state and local elections. Now, this drive intensified in the 1960s, and many of its most famous images come from the 1960s. Martin Luther King continued to lead the movement, but it's important to recognize that it was something that was a continuation of something already in progress. It took on a new dimension under John F. Kennedy. In general, throughout the 50s, it was the Republicans under the Eisenhower administration who defended civil rights. The Democratic Party was almost uniformly against that. John F. Kennedy stood in favor of civil rights and really changed the Democratic Party fundamentally in doing that. In 1963, under Kennedy, there was the March on Washington. And there, Martin Luther King gave his famous speech, "I Have a Dream," which helped to change the conscience of America. I should say that many people in the North and West had no idea that segregation existed to the extent that it did. It's not as if segregation was a national phenomenon. It was something that existed in certain places. In 1963, if you lived in most of the North, you would have no idea that anything was segregated. Even in parts of the South, it was shocking to people when they realized that in a significant part of the country, there were separate drinking fountains, separate schools, and so on. That was not really a national phenomenon. It was partly this speech and this movement that made it a national phenomenon and made people aware that this kind of thing was still going on. As you can see, it was an astounding crowd to which he spoke. It was something that was a huge national movement and drew a great deal of attention to the movement. Now, none of this reached its culmination under President Kennedy. In November of 1963, the president was assassinated in Dallas. This is actually captured on film. Abraham Zapruder happened to be there in Dealey Plaza taking a video on a home camera and saw the president here being hit by the first bullet. So all of this is actually captured on film. There you see a close-up. You see Governor Connolly here reacting. The same bullet evidently hit him. He survived. That was a shock that it's hard for me to explain. The only thing in your lives that would be comparable is the September 11th attacks. Everybody who was alive at that time and was of an age of remembrance remembers exactly where they were when they heard about this and what they were doing. That night on Air Force One, on its way back to Washington, Lyndon Baines Johnson was sworn in as President of the United States. Johnson was similar to Kennedy in some ways. He shared his commitment to civil rights. However, there was an important difference between them. Kennedy, although he had been a senator, was not actually especially effective at working with Congress. Johnson had been in Congress for a long time and was an enormously effective legislator. And so he was able to implement his vision in legislation in a way that few presidents have been able to equal. Here he is being congratulated by Eisenhower on assuming the presidency. Now, why did I start talking? I don't want to talk about the Vietnam War yet. We'll get there. LBJ won re-election dramatically over Goldwater in 1964. Here you can see he took more than 60% of the vote and took really the entire country except for Goldwater's home state and the Deep South. Now, Johnson was important not just because of civil rights, though he did very significant things in the area of civil rights. He also greatly increased spending on social programs, implementing a vision that he called the Great Society. The administration today, here and now, he announced, declares unconditional war on poverty. Well, there's a sort of joke about that. Yes, and the poor lost. And in some ways, it did have positive effects, in some ways, some negative effects that we'll talk about. But also, he passed the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Equal Opportunity Act, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Medicare Act, the Rent Supplement Act, a whole series of acts that got the federal government involved in various levels of civil rights and welfare policies that went far beyond what had gone on before under the Eisenhower administration. As I mentioned, that's an amazing record of accomplishment. Whether you think these are good or bad accomplishments, he was able to implement his vision in legislation in ways that are really unusual. Here he is signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then a year later, the Voting Rights Act followed. Now, there's something that's very odd about all this, which is that social unrest increased as a result of, I shouldn't say as a result, but after these acts, they were followed by an increase in social unrest. Now, some of this was a question of protests that were aimed at enforcing the new law. There was a great deal of resistance to that enforcement, but others are harder to understand. So some of this is natural. Here is the March on Selma, which was there to basically require people to enforce the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. But there were other cases of social unrest that are harder to explain. This is the Watts area of Los Angeles in August of 1965. It looks like a war zone. Rioting there started due to police actions. Here is another photograph of Watts after the riots. Here's Detroit, July of 1967. From the air. See whole city blocks burning. Washington, April 1968. I was on an airplane in Washington, or over Washington in April 1968, and remember seeing just that scene, though I didn't take that photograph. But this was after the assassination of Martin Luther King, Jr. And here's a street-level scene of what was going on in Washington. Now, a good question is why? Why did that kind of social unrest erupt in a variety of cities, especially cities on both coasts? After the passage of the Civil Rights Act, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, these were not riots to enforce the law. This wasn't like the March on Selma. They were highly destructive. What on earth was going on here? Does anybody have any explanations? Well, I don't either. There are a number of things that people have pointed to. I think it's an interesting question to reflect on, but there are all sorts of theories that people have proposed, none of which have really commanded anything like a consensus. One is simply that the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act raised people's expectations a great deal. They thought there would be a dramatic and sudden change in the social order, which did not happen. And so there was disappointment as a result of that. This was supposed to change everything, and in fact it didn't. There was also, and to some extent that plays into the second one, a just general disappointment at the slow pace of change. People, if they didn't expect things to improve or, to be gone, discrimination to be gone overnight, at least they thought there would be a dramatic change to the rate of improvement. When that didn't happen, there was disappointment. There was other attention paid to perverse incentives, not so much as a result of the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act, but instead as a result of the Great Society programs. There were increased incentives, for example, for people not to work or not to hire, since anybody from a minority group now became a potential lawsuit, or to marry, because single people got benefits that married people didn't get under the welfare programs, and so on. And so Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a Democratic senator, argued that this was really leading to the collapse of the black family. There were other arguments, which is, it's hard to see exactly what was going on with poverty rates or rates of inequality at the time, but some people thought that for various economic reasons, The improvements that had been taking place ever since World War II actually slowed during the mid-1960s. Other data contradicts that, but if you accept the data that says there was a slowdown in actual improvement economically, that would be a reason for people to be disappointed. Yes?
With the unintended incentives, how do they argue? Because that's a really short time for some really very big, usually long-term changes to take
Well, exactly. Exactly. Over a generation or two, you can see how these incentives would affect the social structure. But to say, wait, the program was implemented in 1965, and by 1967, the cities are being torn apart by riots. I mean, what happened? Everybody suddenly got divorced and started beating their children and so on in 2 years? I mean, yeah, I agree with you. That it's hard to... the concerns here are not trivial concerns, but they tend to be long-term effects. It's hard to see how, by the Watts riots of 1965, that could be any kind of factor at all. There is another factor. In 1965, one of Johnson's accomplishments was passing an Immigration Act that led to vastly increased immigration. It was called the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, and it really changed the nature of immigration to the United States, greatly increasing it, but also increasing the range of places it was from. Before that, it was primarily Europeans who came to the United States. This is what opened the door wide to immigration from Central and South America and from various other parts of the globe. And what that did mean is that greatly increased immigration led to increased competition at the very bottom of the wage pool, and so may have made it more difficult for people at the bottom to improve their lot by getting higher wage jobs and so on. In any event, however one thinks about all of this, there was a great deal of disappointment after the initial elation of the passing of these acts, and so it remains, I think, an interesting historical question, why they didn't work out better than they did. Well, let's turn our attention to foreign policy. There, too, the basic problem was one that results from the aftermath of the Second World War. The Truman Doctrine, which we've talked about already, is to support free peoples resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressure, wherever, but the idea was we were to assist free people, but they had to work out their own destinies. There was the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, but there was not really an attempt to get the United States directly involved militarily. We've talked about that, so I want to jump to the policy of containment, which became the policy that was really the official American doctrine from Truman on. Here is the author of that policy, George Kennan, who published a paper in Foreign Affairs just under the pseudonym X, in which he argued for a policy of containment. It was a long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. And it involved the adroit and vigilant application of counterforce at a series of constantly shifting geographical and political points. So the idea was that the Soviet Union was an expansive empire. It was going to seek to expand in various directions. It was a question not of trying to resist everywhere, but trying to apply counter-pressure at key points that were especially important. And so the thought was not really to go in and try to roll back Soviet expansion, but simply to contain it within its current sphere until eventually the internal problems brought it down. Now, the first application of that was in the Korean War. North Korea invaded South Korea, and the United Nations, though mostly US troops, responded and defended South Korea. It was a remarkably bloody battle. Stalin encouraged this war partly to drive China into an alliance with Russia and against the United States. That worked, actually. But directly, the war really accomplished nothing. The border didn't move. It was the same as before the war. There was really no justification. There was no popular support in North Korea. There wasn't even any argument that there was some kind of aggression being responded to, and so on. It led to a large number of deaths on all sides. The deaths of 36,000 American soldiers, of 1 million Koreans, more than 200,000 North Korean troops, 58,000 South Korean troops, otherwise civilians, as well as somewhere between 100 and 400,000 Chinese soldiers. So the loss of life here was actually very large. Conditions in the war were difficult. If there's anything this should remind you of, it's World War I, where in the end the war accomplished nothing except killing a large number of people. And, well, there are maps, but I don't want to go into the details of it. It did have some important consequences. The United Nations became an important tool, but also an important propaganda tool. The president became a war-making executive, not needing congressional approval. Okay, this is the first war that was fought by the United States where Congress did not declare war. This was an executive police action. Okay, and that's a phrase that we see again and again in the subsequent decades, where the president simply acts, sending American troops and committing us without congressional approval. It turned China into a first-rate military power, which fought the United States and fought it to a standstill. It also accelerated rearmament really across the globe, among the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, and so on. It also led to a polarization. It led to a very clear sense that there was the free world, there was the communist world, and then there was the third world. And everybody thereafter thought of the world being divided up into the free nations, the communist nations, the non-aligned nations. There were these three camps, and before this, really, it wasn't so obvious. There were lots of countries you wouldn't have known how to classify, but after the Korean War, there was a strong sense that that was the obvious way to classify everyone. Well, in Stalin's last years in the early 1950s, he got crazier and crazier. He conducted a purge and killed over 500,000 people. He was increasingly paranoid. Many intellectuals, in particular, were jailed or murdered. He went on a spree killing poets, killing playwrights, killing musicians, as various fancies affected him. He died in March 1953 under mysterious circumstances. Reportedly, his last words were shrieks about wolves closing in on him. In any event, Eisenhower became the American president in 1953. He had led the armed services in World War II. I can't resist a story. I was in Toronto one time with Rob Coons at a conference, and we had these little name tags identifying us as from the University of Texas at Austin. Well, Canadians have this thing about the United States. And so this guy in the subway started talking to us and said, "You're Americans, right? In Texas?" He said, "I bet you don't know much of anything about Canada. Americans don't know anything about Canada." And so I said, "Oh, you shouldn't feel bad. We don't know anything about anything." But anyway, he said, "Look, you know, I know who the American commander was in World War II. I bet you can't tell me who commanded the Canadian forces in World War II." And Rob Coons said, "Dwight David Eisenhower." That was not an answer that made him happy. In any event, Eisenhower was a very popular president. He was elected overwhelmingly. In fact, both parties wanted him on their ticket because he was such a heroic figure after the war. Paul Johnson describes him as the most successful of America's 20th century presidents. It was a prosperous decade, a peaceful decade. Nixon, his vice president, described him as complex and devious. And Nixon was highly complex and devious, so that means something. In any case, Eisenhower didn't seem that way. He acted as if he really wasn't working very hard at being president, but in fact, before anybody else started at the White House, he would have been working for hours. According to Nixon, Eisenhower got up every morning and was at work by 5 a.m., so that much of his work was done by the time that other people actually appeared in the office. Now, he did have a number of principles. He wanted to avoid war. He believed in strong constitutional control over military action. He thought this precedent of the Korean War, being something that didn't require congressional approval, was a really bad precedent. He thought it was very important that freedom rests on American economic health, and so it was important to keep America economically healthy. But the first thing I want to point out is he did believe in power by stealth. There is a book, The Art of War, by Sun Tzu, an ancient Chinese sage, and it says, look, the best general wins without fighting. And that really was Eisenhower's strategy, win without fighting. It's the second best option, to actually have to fight and win. The best option is to simply subtly tilt the playing field in such a way that the right outcome results without having to directly fight anything. Partly as a result of the Marshall Plan, partly because of the policies in these various countries, and partly because of Eisenhower's support, there was a dramatic economic and political recovery in England, France, Western Germany, Italy, and Spain, in a variety of the countries that had been devastated during World War II. So Europe became an economic powerhouse by the end of the decade. And the US economy did very well too. Here is a 1953 Chevy of the kind that I rode in as a little kid. And that's actually the street I grew up on, of houses that were built like this all over the country for veterans of the Second World War or the Korean War and their families. Now, it was a time of the rise of the middle class. There was a growth in prosperity and consumer culture, but it was from a very low baseline. The economy in the United States in the 50s was improving. It was prosperous relative to what had gone before. But remember, what had gone before was the Second World War and the Great Depression. So it was actually from a very low baseline, and not everything was so great. Productivity growth was actually pretty slow, and there were several recessions. Yeah.
How do you have growth without productivity growth? Well, how do you have wage growth that's higher in real terms than
The main
productivity
thing,
growth?
okay, yes, that's a good question. How do you actually get wage growth and growth in prosperity without much growth in productivity? Answer is the rest of the world was devastated by war. So American manufacturing plants were the only ones left. So there was a huge expansion of markets just because while other countries were rebuilding, if you wanted a car, you pretty much had to get it in the United States. Everybody else's facilities had been severely damaged, and so on and so forth. So really, we were able to, it was through exports, in short, that we were able to accomplish this. That, of course, wasn't to last forever, and in fact, by the end of the 60s, Japan and other Asian nations had really taken over that role of manufacturer of the world. But for a while, the United States was in that role, and it was a good role to play. Now, the prosperity level is much lower than what we have now. That house I grew up in, that was about 900 square feet. My brother lived in an alcove. He didn't have his own room. I had my own room, but it was a very small room. So, and if a family had one car, that was doing well. If you ate meat a couple of times a week, that was doing well. You might go out to dinner on your birthday. The first movie I ever went to, I saw when I was 6, and the next one was when I was 8, and so on. So, a child might get to go to the movie theater once or twice a decade. This was not affluence by our standard. But nevertheless, it was affluent by what had gone before. This was the advent of the age of television. Here you see a family gathered around watching a show on their nice black and white TV, which would get typically 4 channels. And there were popular shows. Here is The Honeymooners. Here is Amos and Andy. There were a variety of, here are the top TV shows in 1955. The $64,000 Question. I Love Lucy, The Ed Sullivan Show, Disneyland, The Jack Benny Program, December Bride, I don't remember that one, You Bet Your Life, and Dragnet, Just the Facts, ma'am, etc. Well, anyway, this was a sort of different America from what came back before, but then there were other trends that started. Elvis Presley making rock and roll famous, and the government's role shifted dramatically during this time too. Most of what the federal government spent money on in the 50s was defense. It was the military budget, taking up more than half the budget. Eisenhower started the Interstate Highway Program, and by the 60s, defense spending became a smaller and smaller part of the budget despite Vietnam, and social spending increased. Here you can see defense spending declining after 1945, jumping up for Korea, and another peak in Vietnam, but overall a pattern of decline throughout all this period. Entitlement spending, i.e. social spending of various kinds, increasing dramatically in the 1960s through the 70s and continuing its path upward. Now, let me jump to some other aspects of what took place in the 60s. We've mentioned John F. Kennedy and the way in which he changed things with respect to civil rights. He also changed the conception of America's role in the world. John Quincy Adams had expressed long ago a certain concept of America's role. He said, wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will be America's heart, her benedictions and her prayers. She goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She's the well-wisher of the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. So John Quincy Adams' idea was, America is on the side of freedom. And whenever people are fighting for freedom, we're on their side, but spiritually on their side. In terms of material, in terms of actual military intervention, we defend only our own. So we're with you in spirit, but we're not going to do anything much about it. You can see how that had already changed with the Truman Doctrine, this idea of containment, of having to apply careful counterpressure at certain key points. Well, he thought there was this need for occasional counterforce to communist expansion, and that is something that went beyond that traditional John Quincy Adams bipartisan consensus that had existed all the way up to World War II. And so Truman and Eisenhower then expanded that to say, look, we should defend our own freedom or those of our allies whose survival is vital to American self-interest. The thought was it's not only our own freedom that might be directly threatened, but maybe our self-interest is involved with the freedom of others. We have certain key allies and we should defend them, as we defended the British, for example, in World War II. Now that was a significant expansion already. It led to intervention in Korea, in Cuba, and ultimately in Vietnam. But Kennedy changed it even further. He said, let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to ensure the survival and success of liberty. Now notice that's gone from one extreme to the other. He doesn't say our own liberty, notice, he says just liberty. John Quincy Adams says, if you're fighting for freedom, we wish you well. John Kennedy says, oh, we don't just wish you well. We will pay any price, bear any burden to support you, okay, to help you. And that is a dramatic expansion. It's no longer this idea of occasional counterforce. This is instead something much more dramatic. We're on freedom's side anywhere in the world. It was a kind of universalism. And that was a universalism expressed in lots of other ideals. In his creation of the Peace Corps, to try to go into countries peacefully and bring economic development. The Green Berets, which were meant to be pinpoint military forces highly trained to be capable of doing things all over the globe. The Alliance for Progress, an alliance of nations who would work together in economic and political cooperation. And in general, an increase in economic and military aid to foreign nations. It was a much more aggressive conception of what America's role was. We were not just to be world police, we were really to be on the side of freedom throughout. Now, there were a number of places where this got us involved rather quickly. One was Cuba. Fidel Castro began a rebellion in the early 1950s. There really wasn't much fighting in Cuba. It was mostly fought in the New York Times. And the leader of Cuba at the time was Batista. A State Department official was quoted in one of these news stories as saying, I know Batista is considered by many as a son of a bitch, but American interests come first, at least he's our son of a bitch. Okay? But because of, basically Castro was winning this propaganda war, and by 1957, now notice under Eisenhower, the Department of State decided that Batista had to go. So they ended up basically engineering his replacement by Castro. Now Castro, as soon as he took power in Cuba, postponed elections for 18 months. He abolished political parties. He invested all legislative power in the cabinet. He court-martialed his opponents, then saying revolutionary justice is based not on legal precepts but on moral conviction. In other words, if I disagree with you morally, I have the right to imprison you. He allied himself with the USSR, and so Cuba went from being a friend and close ally of the United States to being an enemy, and also went from being one of the richest nations in Latin America to one of the poorest. Here is Havana in 2009. By the way, notice, I thought I had some pictures of Havana earlier. Anyway, I did, I must have gotten rid of them. But notice the 1950s cars still on the streets. In fact, if you want a working 1950s automobile, probably the best place to go is Havana, because there's still plenty of them. Anyway, Kennedy realized by the time he took office that this was shaping up to be a disaster for freedom. And so he first attempted to overturn this revolution and throw Castro out of office. He supported 12,000 armed Cuban exiles who landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba to start an uprising against Castro. The result of this was a fiasco. Kennedy faced the following dilemma. He didn't want to commit American troops and risk a confrontation with the Soviet Union, but he wanted it to succeed. The problem was, without American military support, there was no way it could succeed. And so Castro used this as an opportunity to shoot those in prison, jail 100,000 others for being supposedly in league with the invaders, and declare himself dictator. There you can see the Bay of Pigs. It was not the most obvious place to invade. It was all the way on the other side of the island, which made it very hard to keep this secret. And here you see the people who had invaded being almost immediately taken prisoner. They badly needed American air cover. Kennedy didn't provide it. And so some were killed, the rest were all captured. Now, not long after that came the Cuban Missile Crisis. In February of 1962, the US began an economic embargo on Cuba. Well, the response to that was not what you might have expected. The Soviet Union began installing missile bases in Cuba, which were, after all, just a few miles offshore from Florida. Khrushchev sent 42 more than 1,000-mile range missiles into Cuba. and 2,200-mile missiles, 24 anti-aircraft missile groups, and 22,000 Soviet troops, all of which were revealed by U-2 spy planes. So here is the range of those missiles. There were a significant number that could hit Florida, but then some that could hit a wider area, including Texas and Washington, D.C., and then some that could hit really almost any part of the continental United States, or the populated part of Canada. In any case, Kennedy's cabinet met in what was considered the first real crisis of his presidency, and one of the great crises in American foreign policy, really throughout the 20th century. How should one respond? Well, what responses were open to them? There were really 5 options. One was to do nothing, to allow the missile installations to take place. One was to apply diplomatic pressure, and in back channels, tell the Soviets to cut it out. One was to impose a naval blockade, a so-called quarantine on the island to prevent these missile shipments. One was to engage in an aerial attack to bomb the installations. And one was to actually send in troops and invade. Now I want you to imagine for a moment that you're in Kennedy's cabinet. Which of these 5 options do you argue for?
Blockade, I guess.
Why the blockade?
I feel like it's not. I mean, if you do an all-out air attack, that's pretty dramatic. And the blockade is kind of dramatic, but you're not. It's not like a violent thing compared to an air attack. You know what I'm saying?
Good, good. There are
It's a job.
22,000
It's a
Russian
job.
troops in Cuba, right? And so if you attack, you're attacking Russian troops, right? Either bombing them or directly invading. Do you want a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union? No way. So that was the main argument against D or E on this list. Exactly. That was too direct a confrontation with the Soviets. Yeah.
When they met, did they already know all of, like, was everything already in place? Were all the stuff you listed, it was already there?
That was already known
That was
because
already there,
of,
and that's why they met?
yeah. Yeah. That's not, yeah, this isn't Monday morning
So the
quarterbacking.
naval
They had that.
blockade wouldn't have gotten rid of the missiles, they would have stayed there.
It wouldn't have gotten rid of what was already there, exactly. It could only stop additional shipments from coming in.
Where we were at.
It
Yeah.
would still be a harder decision than we're making it sound now because of the benefit of historical, being able to look back on the past. We're
Right.
seeing naval blockade as an option which doesn't lead to war. That is an act of war under pretty much any international.
Well, right, this
Accord.
risks a military confrontation
So
on
you
the
call
high
it
seas.
quarantine instead.
No, exactly right,
Russia
exactly.
wasn't supposed to be there anyway,
So,
right?
well,
Russia couldn't be like, hey, you're blockading us, right? They couldn't get mad about that.
Yes, they
because
could.
they were supposed
They
to be
did.
like helping the
they, well,
Cubans build missiles where they
The
really.
Cubans and the USSR are allied, so they're
So-
protecting their interests.
yeah, right. So were they supposed to be? Well, what were they exactly violating by doing this? It was a very tricky thing. It's not like there was a clear violation of international law here. In fact, the Kennedy administration had just before this installed missile bases in Turkey, which is not very far from southern Russia. And so the Russians thought, hey, you know, this is just tit for tat. This is doing just to you what you just did to us. Well, Kennedy gave a dramatic speech in which he adopted the quarantine option. He didn't want to do the first 2. He thought that would accomplish nothing. So he instituted the naval blockade. Now, during this time, there was really imminent fear of a confrontation with the Soviet Union. School children like me were taught to duck and cover. There were air raids. In fact, the entire city I lived in had a mock air raid, and the entire city shut down. We had to go down, and actually I was one of the green light kids. I lived close to the school, so I was sent home so I could go hide in the basement. In any event, there was a resolution of this kind. We went to DEFCON 2. All missile crews were placed on maximum alert, and really the entire nation readied for nuclear war. But the Soviets backed down. 2 days later, they approached the quarantine line and they stopped and turned back. And the Russians agreed to dismantle their missile bases in Cuba. However, something that was not announced at the time is that we agreed to remove our missiles from Turkey. So, at the time this was thought of as a great victory for the Kennedy administration. Historically now, it doesn't look like much of a victory, but it appeared the same way to the Soviet Union. Within the Soviet Union, this was perceived as a terrible defeat for Khrushchev, and actually led to his downfall. Anyway, we're out of time. Next time, actually, we'll have to figure out what to do about next time. I don't know whether to proceed or whether to talk about Borges. So I will send you an email and ask your opinion about that.